In Luke 19, he tells a very similar parable. It's even more explicit. He talks about the parable of the minas. Again, an amount of money, very similar. Master, 3 servants, 2 were faithful, 1 was not. For the 2 who were faithful, Jesus said they will be promoted and they will be put in charge of whole cities. Not just one, but multiple cities, like not just mayor, but governor of an entire region of people. And I take from this that really, honestly, God wants to promote you to great positions of power and authority and prominence and significance, of great influence. He wants that for you. But not here. Not yet. Well, what about fame? Does God really want you to be famous? I believe he does. I believe God wants you to be world famous. Now, you think about fame and think about who is famous in our day. Our newspapers are filled with the names of famous and important people. Actors and ambassadors, authors and athletes, monarchs and musicians, presidents and popes. And the pages of history are also filled with these same kinds of people. But have you ever noticed what kinds of people are recorded in God's history book? The Bible is filled with accounts of obscure, anonymous, and unimportant people who loved and served God faithfully. In fact, they often end up being the heroes of the story. So, for example, if we start in the New Testament and take the case of Paul. Who was Paul? Well, nobody important. Paul was just a washed-up has-been. He used to be a prestigious religious leader among the Jewish people. But he had been disgraced, he had been rejected by his colleagues and by his people. His contemporaries regarded him as little more than a criminal and a troublemaker. He was a man of no import. And yet, look at the prominence that God gives to this man in his history book. Roughly half of the history recorded in the book of Acts is about Paul and his mission work. Beyond that, roughly half of the entire New Testament was written by the same man. And next to Peter, I would argue that Paul is probably the most famous of all the apostles, even though he was a latecomer to that bunch. But now, I'd like to contrast the difference between Paul and the political leaders and government officials with whom he interacted. Because those political and government leaders, they were important men. These were men of power. They were men of prominence. And so a quick pop quiz here. You think about the times when Paul was put on trial. Can any of you name any of the government officials who actually put Paul on trial? Can you name any of those guys? Go ahead and shout it out if you know. Festus? Anyone else? Don't be shy. It's harder, isn't it? It's hard to remember people like Festus and Felix and Agrippa. These men were famous in their day. Everybody knew who they were. They were important. They were powerful. Paul? He was nothing. He was just an overzealous religious agitator who needed to be locked up from time to time for his own good. But now, today, who is the famous one? Who is the honored one? Who is it that we remember and admire and want to emulate? It's Paul, right? In fact, I would venture a guess that we would probably never have even heard of these other men if it weren't for the fact that their lives just happened to cross paths with the man that God made famous. Someone has said that today we name our children things like John and Paul, and we name our dogs things like Caesar and Nero. How about the Old Testament? Do you remember a story in the Old Testament about an old Jewish man who got in really big trouble? And he got in trouble because he prayed to the God of Israel instead of to the king. And so the king had this man thrown into a pit of hungry lions. But God spared him. He shut the mouths of the lions. He protected this man. Have you heard that story? Someone tell me who that man was. Daniel. Almost everyone has heard that story. Now, what was the name of the king who threw him into the lion's den? What was his name? Do you remember? It was Darius. King Darius, much harder to remember. He was the first Mede to rule over the recently conquered Babylonian Empire. Now, I'd like you to think about the difference between these two men. Darius was a powerful man. He was king, after all, but he was beyond king. He was considered a god. In fact, he was such a powerful and feared deity that an entire nation dedicated a whole month to praying exclusively to him. Now that's some power. Everybody knew who Darius was. He was world famous. But who was Daniel? Nobody. He was just some old man left over from the previous administration. Nobody knew quite what to do with him. His colleagues didn't like him. In fact, they hated him. They wanted him fired, actually executed. He was a washed-up old man. He was small, powerless, and expendable. And yet Daniel is a household name. And we all have trouble remembering King what's-his-name. In fact, just to drive that home a little further, think about King Darius. Can any of you name, besides the fact that he threw Daniel into the lion's den, can any of you name anything else that King Darius did in his entire administration? Just one thing, anything. I can't either. And that kind of illustrates my point. Once again, we probably wouldn't have even heard or know about King Darius if he hadn't been connected to the man that God made famous. So here's my point. Very few of us are considered important people. Hardly any of us are famous. But what if? What if God is still writing his version of human history? What if God is still writing the Bible? What if the book of Acts has a second volume? What if God is still recording stories of his faithful servants, obscure, unimportant people who love Jesus with all their hearts and serve him with great distinction? For example, what if in God's history book, Abner Vickery is remembered as one who gave sacrificially to the work of foreign missions? What if Dolores Birch is held up as an example of one who forgave an enemy and loved and prayed for them? What if David Peterson is listed among those who prayed with great faith for the powerful spiritual awakening that God sent on his church and his community?